Welcome. We are so happy to have you here at the History Center. My name is Andrea Hatzel. I'm the education manager here, and we are so happy to be hosting today's panel on the history of news. We are bringing some anecdotes from experts in their field, and this is all attached to our newest exhibit called Breaking the News, the Past and Uncertain Future of Local Print Journalism. So that exhibit will be open through the end of this year. You're welcome to see the exhibit after the panel today. We would also like to give a big thank you to Indiana Humanities for supporting this program in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities as well. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to have conversations like this, and as well as a lot of other future programs coming up. I see David Moritz here. He's got a program coming up next month, if you're interested. It's a show, tell, and touch with his teaching collection of historic newspapers. So be sure to come back out. Those dates are listed on our website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Christine Ogan will be our moderator for this afternoon.
Do I click this up?
Yep. Should be
There we go.
You're all set.
Okay. So as she said, I am Chris Ogan, and I am a retired member of what was the journalism school at Indiana University. I'm also, I wasn't retired from, but I worked at the Herald Telephone, then Herald Times, and so I'm going to be moderating today.
Could you elevate the microphone to your mouth?
Sure. Oh, okay. All right. So first I'm going to provide introductions. I hope these won't take too long. They have all had illustrious careers and many awards, so I'm going to try to get through those fairly quickly and get to our questions. So we'll start with Bob down there at the end. Bob Zaltsberg was the former editor, now retired editor at the Herald Times, formerly the Herald Telephone. He's worked at the newspaper since 1975. Think of that. Starting out as a reporter of sports and news, and that followed on his graduation from Miami University in Ohio, where he worked for a short time as sports editor at the Plainfield, Indiana newspaper. In his first 9 years, he moved up to region editor, city editor, and then managing editor. And then he thought, well, maybe I'll move on out to a bigger newspaper. But Bill Schrader, who was editor at the time, said, yeah, why don't you hang out here for a while, and then you can be the editor of the paper. And so he decided that's what he wanted to do. He thought he might have to wait several years. It was only 2 years before Schrader moved to Bedford, and Bob was tapped to be the editor in 1985. He held that job until his retirement in 2019, just days before the paper was sold to Gatehouse Media, and then Gatehouse Gannett, I guess, is the way it's phrased today. A national chain with properties in 38 states. We are proud to be one of those, I guess. Since that time, he's turned his talents to teaching part-time at IU in the media school, and he's been co-hosting Noon Edition, a program you probably listen to every Friday on WFIU, and now he's producing and leading a community-driven project called City Limits, probably other things that I don't even know about. He's received many awards over the years, including induction into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame, 2 Blue Ribbon Newspaper Awards from the Hoosier State Press Association, and in 2019, then IU President Michael McRobbie awarded Bob the university's Thomas Hart Benton Memorial Medallion. It is given to honor those who have shown meritorious national or international service to the university or made exceptional achievements that reflect the central values and principles of Indiana University and contribute to the betterment of humanity. Quite a career, which is ongoing. Next, we have Janice Rickert, who got into the newspaper business after she graduated from high school in 1973. She and Bob Hammel were both employed by the Huntington, Indiana Herald Press. She worked in the summers throughout her college years at Ball State University to fill in for other employees who took vacations, mostly as a reporter or photographer. Following stints at Fortville and Franklin and the news and sports side of the paper, she was hired by the Herald Telephone, which didn't become the Herald Times until 1989, in case you don't remember that. Since that time, right up until her recent retirement in 2022, Janice has worked as copy editor, page designer, and manager at the paper. Now, a copy editor doesn't often get to see her name in the paper, but editors work every bit as hard as reporters and are almost always involved in producing the big stories, only without the byline. Janice recalls having worked on many sports stories, including the wins by IU basketball and soccer teams, the long saga that included many stories related to Westinghouse and the PCBs dumped around the area, the building of I-69, the controversies over homeless shelter, the many elections over the years, stories about John Mellencamp, the closure of RCA Thompson, makes your head spin all the things that happened in this town, and a bunch of more, the growth of the Cook Group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Since 2019, Janice has been involved in higher level management as the #2 leader of the HT's newsroom, doing, as she wrote in her farewell column, editing and planning, providing institutional knowledge and continuity, and generally being a utility player on the newsroom. Went through 4 different editors, news directors in the wake of longtime editor Bob Zaltsberg's retirement. When she recounted the reasons she stayed at the HT for all those nearly 5 decades, she said, "There are many reasons I've stayed at the HT for nearly 42 years, including the wonder that is Bloomington and the technological and business model changes that have kept me constantly learning, essentially starting a new job several times. But the main reason is the wealth of talented, caring colleagues I've had the honor to work beside, people who saw the work not just as a job, but as a calling. Reporters, photographers, editors, designers, and those working in other departments were dedicated to serving the community and those currently on the staff as well." Bob Hammel, a native of, also as I said, a native of Huntington, Indiana, wrote his first sports column in 1954 at age 17 in the Herald Press of his hometown, a story about then not so well-known sportscaster Chris Schenkel, also a native of Huntington. Bob moved around the state a bit after his freshman year at IU, working in Huntington, Fort Wayne, Kokomo, Peru, and Indianapolis. But by 1960, he had decided that the Herald Telephone was the place for him to stay. I guess, yes. But though he settled down in 1970, here he covered sports stories around the state and nation, and even went to the 1972 Olympics in Munich, largely to write the stories of Mark Spitz's 7 gold medals in the event. But that was also the year the Munich massacre of 11 players and coaches and 1 police officer by a group of Palestinians. And Bob was there to report that horrific event as well. Of course, he's best known for his coverage of the Indiana men's basketball program over the years as it rose to capture NCAA championships in 76, 81, and 87, with Bob Knight as the Hoosiers coach. He wrote several books about the team and the coach, including the co-authoring of Knight's autobiography, My Story, and several other books about sports and sports figures. Then he selected Bloomington's Bill Cook as the subject of another book. Hammel's work became linked with the rise of the Indiana men's basketball program and its coach, Bob Knight. The Hoosiers won, I went over that once before, didn't I? I have repeated in my computer, sorry. Bob was named Indiana Sports Writer of the Year an unprecedented 16 times, and 4 times was named winner of the Indiana Sports Writer and Sportscasters Corky Lamb Award. In 1990, he was selected to the U.S. Basketball Writers Hall of Fame. He was presented with the Kurt Gowdy Award by the Naismith Hall of Fame in 1995, the highest honor for a basketball writer. He received the Silver Medal from the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame in 1996 and was inducted into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame in 1997. He's also been awarded the Burt McGrain Award by the College Football Hall of Fame and Jake Wade Award by the College Sports Information Directors of America. A lot. Clearly a lot. So, with this illustrious panel we have before us, my job is to ask them questions. And I am told I am to keep them to 1 to 2 minutes for their answers, or we will never get through these. And the questions, some of them will be short, others you might want to go on for a period of time, but restrain yourselves, please. Otherwise, all those people who asked these questions, many of these came from online sources, so they are mixed in with a few that I have put here. So number one, I'm going to, and this time, sometimes I'll pick out one of you to ask a question of, sometimes I want all three of you to respond. So the first one is for all of you. What was your proudest moment over the years you were employed at the HT? But start down there.
We okay here? Can you hear me? That's an impossible question to answer. There were so many proud moments when we would, breaking news is big, obviously. So the huge breaking news stories, many of which Janice mentioned or were mentioned in Janice's introduction, getting the staff together, having the staff work really hard to make sure that we covered things like the 9/11. Let me just say this. We had 3 different specials that I can remember, extras that I can remember. One was Bob Hammel wasn't here because it was Bob Knight was convicted in Puerto Rico, and I wasn't here for that either. So that was not one of my prouder moments. But we had an extra when Won Jun Yoon was killed, if you remember that story, and that happened on a day when we didn't have a newspaper because it was 4th of July weekend. I was proud we were able to do that. And we had an extra on the day of 9/11 that we put out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The towers were hit at 9 o'clock roughly in the morning, and we had an extra on the street at 2 o'clock. And the extra, there might be one upstairs, but it's full of local content. I mean, the local content.
I have one, and I'm bringing it when.
Okay. But the local content was strong. So we talked a lot. Bloomington's a very active community. We were getting calls of my son's in New York or my husband's in New York or the Pentagon. And so that was another problem. There are many others, but let me turn to Janice.
I think 9/11 and our response to it is probably one of the biggest stories we've covered during my 42 years. I think what makes me proud is the staff that we had whenever anything unexpected happened, whether it was Won Jun Yoon or 9/11 or a fire or a tornado. The staff invariably was willing to come in and work and drop whatever they were doing in their life. And it didn't matter if it was their assigned hours. It didn't matter if they'd already worked 40 hours that week. They cared about the news and about getting it out to our readers, and they responded. I was frequently working on the desk at night when most people had gone home, and something would happen. And it's like, no matter who I called, nobody ever said, "Oh, gee, I'm in the middle of my favorite TV program," or I got to do something. That's like I might have to figure out what to do with my kids or whatever. But one way or another, they were going to help cover that story.
Thanks.
That one.
Oh, you can use this one. Yes, this share.
I'm not sure I could pick a proudest moment. It should be when I was involved with Bill Schrader in hiring that guy down at that end, because that worked out to be a tremendous move. It was interesting because we each had a position open and in news and sports, and the 2 leading candidates turned out to be Bob and Rick Bozich, who ultimately went to Lafayette, and we split on, decided that we'd hire them both in a half news, half sports position, and Bob's version of that is that half sports and half news meant 30 hours in each, but it turned out to be one heck of a draft class because those 2 are both in halls of fame. They were just outstanding people that made our paper a lot better over the years, and I was always personally very proud of what they became. Otherwise, it was just more of a privilege than a source of pride to have the chance to carry out what the guy who hired me, Perry Stewart, what he envisioned, and for a small town sports section. His idea was the Olympics. I didn't just cover Munich. I went to 5 Olympic Games, and that's an enormous expenditure for a small paper. And there were no other papers our size close at those competitions, and that was all Perry Stewart. And I do want to take a minute to congratulate the History Center for the exhibit they have upstairs, because that is marvelous and tells a tremendous story on the passage of time and in Bloomington newspaper history. And I was particularly pleased that there is a segment on Perry Stewart, who lived only 4 years here. He died at 41, but he was the biggest influence on my life and the newspaper business. And I really think he's the person that made Bloomington a really good newspaper town.
Could you pass that back to Janice, because my second question you already answered, which was, can you recall a moment that made you want to become a journalist? And then maybe why you came to the HT. So he's already told us that. Janice, how about you?
I was interested in reading and writing and figuring out how things work from an early age. I grew up in a photographic studio. My grandfather and father ran Rickert Studio in Huntington, and my father was a very well-respected portrait photographer and did other types of photography as well in a small town.
He took our wedding picture.
So the idea of making something every day was something I wanted to do, but taking pictures of people that they would like of themselves was not really how I wanted to, count on getting a paycheck every week. People are very critical of pictures of themselves. And my father was very good at it, and I didn't think I could be better than him. But taking pictures for a newspaper, that was different. That was capturing a moment and, not trying to assuage somebody's self-vision. So initially I got into newspapering, mostly doing photography and also doing some writing. I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and went on from there, just stayed in the business. It was a way to serve the public without as much scrutiny on yourself as you would have as, say, a teacher or a social worker, which, you're not always, you're trying to solve somebody else's problems as a social worker. And I would rather help people solve their own problems, which I think is what newspapers are about, is telling people what they need to know to live their life better.
Great.
Two reasons I got into journalism. One was I was just sort of steeped in it when I was a kid. We got 4 newspapers at home, and I loved reading the 4 newspapers. And the other reason is my older brother, whose name is Art, oddly enough now he spells his last name Zaltsberg with an S instead of a Z, worked for WOWO Radio in Fort Wayne, and he's a member of the Indiana Sports Writers and Sportscasters Hall of Fame. But I watched his career in radio news, and I thought, that's what I want to do. And I wasn't good at it when I went to college. I was better at the writing side. And so I got my first job at that Plainfield Messenger newspaper. I got to Bloomington because, as Bob Hammel said, there were 2 jobs open that were combined, and I got one of them. And one of the great opportunities was to be able to work with Bob, because this paper was well regarded in Indiana at the time. And I would say about 90% of that reason was because Bob was here and all the great work he was doing. And I was going to be able to work those 30 hours in sports along with those 30 hours in news. And I really enjoyed it for a couple of years until I thought maybe 40 hours would be better in one or the other. So.
Okay.
I would like, Chris, to, you mentioned how soon the idea of journalism, well, when I was 10, my dad was a policeman, and so we had a typewriter set up at home, and I would go to the Huntington High School basketball games. By that time, my mom was buying me on Christmas and birthday, my gifts for a basketball scorebook or a football scorebook. I'd keep score on the radio, or I mean baseball, football, and baseball, or basketball and baseball, and so I think it had a really good team in my 10-year-old year, and my elementary school was the site of the gymnasium. So school would get out at 4 o'clock, and they didn't have such things as season tickets, and I would go right from the school over to the stand in line, wait for a ticket to get the first ticket, and I had a seat right under the one that basket right on the well. There was only one end that had permanent bleachers, and I got a spot there. Well, there was a doctor who was a big fan, and he would come in right at game time, and he would buy the ticket from me for the price of the ticket, and I would sit in front of him with my scorebook, and then I would go home, and then the Huntington paper did not have a Saturday edition. It was Friday afternoon, Sunday morning. And I would spend Saturday morning on my dad's typewriter typing out a story, and then compare it with the professional guy the next day. And it was a fun start, and that's how long my well, there's no better word than dream of having the kind of life I ended up having started right there.
So you were in training really early.
Well, it was a self form of training.
Chris, can I add a 1-minute anecdote about
Sure.
Bob Hammel as one of my first bosses? So my first sports assignment, I was 4 days at the HT, and I thought I was going to get fired because I was sent to cover a football game in Cloverdale, Indiana, and I was on 231 north of Spencer and got behind a huge accident. And I got to the game at halftime. And I thought, oh, this is not good. So yes, Laura. After I got home, I had to put, after I got back, wrote this. No, I wrote the sports story, then put on the news hat and called and got the information on the wreck. It was a fatality.
I'm really glad.
Yes, but I got back and I thought I was going to get fired. But I did have a story because this kind sports writer at the Greencastle paper gave me all his halftime stats, and so I was able to get a story. That happened to be Dan Demme, who worked for the HT for many years after that. But yeah, so I thought, but Bob was so kind. He was like, well, you got a story.
So I'm going to shift this a little bit and ask you what you think the biggest change has been to newspapers since the time you started working.
I guess I'm in a position to have the longest range view since I started about 70 years ago. So, but I think, I keep reading that the loss of the small town paper, or now it's much bigger than the small to medium sized papers, is the lack of supervision of local government, local news in that sense, and there's no question that's true. But my sense through all those years at the various newspapers was papers this size, and especially the Herald Telephone and Herald Times under Barry Stewart, the newspaper was more of a conscience of a community, and reminded us of what we should be doing, and who we should be proud of, and the whole idea of obits, for example. And when I was really young, I thought that was a waste of time that we played those so big in Huntington. The obits made the front page in Huntington. And when we moved inside, I thought that was a great addition, great movement. And today I don't, because I think that's the one place where we identify with our community, and our people look for those things, and they keep track of their fellow citizens, and the newspaper can remind us when we need to do something as a community for people, or and to recognize people who do those things. I think the overlooking of local government is important, but to me, that role of conscience, of reminding you that you're citizens and you're all in this together, I think that's the part that we're losing.
When I was a kid, we had our local paper, and we got a paper from Fort Wayne, and we had 3 TV stations with Walter Cronkite on one of them, and those were our main news sources. Maybe you got Life or Look or Newsweek or whatever, and you learned some things from there. But by and large, people got their news from the same sources and the same basic information, and then could decide what they thought about it. And in today's internet world, there's a bazillion different sources with a bazillion different views on life. And in some ways, that's really good. I mean, we get a lot more variety of thought, but it's a lot harder to tell what's really going on. And it's a lot harder to have a community understanding of the world or your own community, because people are getting information so many different ways, and it's not filtered or fact-checked or anything else most of the time. And while maybe it's bad that, the Herald Telephone would figure out every day what we thought the community wanted to know and what it needed to know, whether it wanted to read about the school board meeting or not, they needed to know. And we would give them both. We would try to give them, the peanut strip and the comics and what's on sale at the grocery store or Macy's this week. A lot of different things that you might be interested in knowing. And then we would also tell you what we thought you needed to know about government, about your neighbors, about, trends in the world. And put it all in a package that every day you could spend 10 minutes skimming through and have some idea what was going on, or an hour or two really reading and have a more in-depth idea of what was going on.
Could you, since you were on the editing side of this, also talk a little bit about how you saw technology affecting the changes that took place over time?
I never worked in hot type, but the Herald Telephone, when I started working there, was still using a press that was meant for hot type. So we used crappy plastic plates made from photographic type, and printed a mostly black and white paper every day. We had spot color. Oh, we get to have red today. We get to have blue today. And then we switched over to an offset press with full color capabilities. And then there was the internet, and then there was smartphones, and the technology has just kept evolving, and the newspaper tries to do all those different things.
Did that have an impact on content at any point?
I remember them saying, oh, when the new press comes, when the new front end system comes, deadlines are going to move back, not forward, and it's all going to be easier than it was.
Technology, is always a double-edged sword. It gives you capabilities you didn't have before. With a website, we could run video of something that describing it is great, but seeing it sometimes is a lot better. Reflecting on it in print is better than just a flash in the pan and it's gone. All these sides are good, but broadening what we could do without also broadening the staff also kind of created conflicts. I spent the last couple of years working on the paper under Gatehouse Gannett ownership, and Gatehouse and Gannett are not dedicated to print journalism. They see it as dying, and I don't blame them. The number of subscriptions we have in this town compared to what we had in our heyday is a fraction. And because the internet being what it is and advertising and subscriptions being our source of income for the industry, not just Gannett, but any newspaper in the land, people clicking on a story and actually opening it and reading it tends to dictate what Gannett thinks is important and we should spend time on. And people don't always click on that school board story that they should know about. Maybe they read the headline and they feel like they know enough and they go on. Well, there was no click. There's no click, there's no evidence the reader thought it was important, and there's no evidence that time and effort should be put into it. It's only your journalism ethics that make you do it anyway. And I think our local editors and reporters are doing a really good job of still trying to do those stories. But there's a limited number of people to do it, and there's corporate expectations about getting as many clicks as you can. And that's a sad situation.
Bob, would you take that same question and talk about staffing and circulation in changes over time?
Yeah, I'll talk about staffing, circulation, and I'm going to throw in advertising. Staffing, we were, I'm working on a project now with WFIU, TIU, and looking at what happens when you have private equity ownership, which is what we have. I want to make sure and say, because Jill's in the audience, that Jill is doing a great job and doing her very best with what I would consider to be a difficult situation. Laura's here too. Yeah, very. So, I hope you don't take anything I say to be critical of the Herald Times or local journalists. But, staffing, it was already sliding. The trends were already there in terms of what was happening to newspapers well before Gatehouse bought the Herald Times. We had 51 people in the newsroom at one point. Some of them were part-time, most of them were full-time. I've done the calculations. It was like 40 or 41 FTEs in the newsroom when I know by 2014, we had dropped to 32 full-time people in the newsroom. By the day that I retired, which was not a few days before Gannett bought it, it was hours. There were 29, so we were down to 29. So that was already in decline. And I also want to say it was hours because by 6 o'clock that evening, I couldn't get my email anymore because they'd switched over to Gatehouse. So I couldn't finish my work. I had to leave. On the circulation side, circulation peaked at about 31,500 daily, and we combined with Bedford and Martinsville for a Sunday paper that was in the 47,000 range. By the time I left, we were probably in the mid to high teens, maybe 16, 17,000. So circulation was on the way down. But the biggest single change with technology had to do with the business model. So the advertising revenue took a nosedive. And if you just think about it, advertisers used to go to the HT to reach their audience. And with new technology, they had all sorts of other ways to reach an audience. So the HT had lost automobile advertising for the most part, had lost real estate advertising, had lost a lot of local business advertising because people could create their own websites and advertise on their own, or they could go to some other area. So the business model has suffered tremendously in the last 15 to 20 years. And I think what you're seeing now is just an acceleration of what was happening before. Does that help?
Yeah, because it doesn't all go to the internet then. There are other competing sources that
Yeah, I mean, there are tons. I mean, if you know newspaper economics, I mean, it used to be that 80% of our revenue came from circulation, 20% from advertising, 20% came from circulation. I would bet that's probably closer to 50-50 for Gannett newspapers now. I don't know, but I'm just sort of speculating that. But there's a lot less of a pie to even get that 50-50 out of.
Okay,
The internet also affected all the businesses that used to advertise for us. Macy's isn't here anymore. Kmart isn't here anymore. A lot of the national and not local businesses got eaten up by Amazon. So there were a lot of changes. Nobody's clipping a coupon anymore to go into the department store to buy something because the department store is not there.
So, but Amazon, we can go back to that for a minute, if that was affecting the amount of advertising, what happened to local businesses over that time that also impacted you? I mean, were there local businesses that you depended upon that just folded?
They may have been, but in the part of my role was to sit on the budget committee at the Herald Times. So I saw a little bit more about the business side of things. And a very high percentage of the money came from the big advertisers. So the car dealers would spend $1 million a year or whatever, and a mom and pop might spend $4,000 a year. So it took a lot of mom and pops to going out of business or whatever they did to, or coming into business to make up for an auto dealer contract that went from $1 million a year to, $500,000 a year, or a Kroger contract that went from $1 million a year to nothing. So the groceries used to be huge, right? Groceries used to be huge. I mean, there's still on the menu, and the food stuff goes in Wednesday's paper. And the reason it started in Wednesday's paper is that was grocery day. That was the advertising day for all the grocery inserts.
So you talked a bit about this, especially Janice, but what role do you think the newspaper plays in a community like Bloomington? And then what are we losing, and can this be regained somehow by reshuffling things in the local press, or is this just gone forever? You've talked about picking up that newspaper when you were a kid and
I'll start.
all of that.
I don't think it's gone forever. I don't know what the solution is. I was just visiting with Todd Schurz, who was the CEO and president of Schurz when the company was sold. I was just up there Thursday visiting with him. And he reminded me, I was talking to him about what was the mission of Schurz Company, 4-year newspapers. He reminded me of this great guy we had working for us, Charles Pittman, who Bob knows as Charlie Pittman, because he was the first African-American recruit for Penn State under Joe Paterno. Charles was our vice president of news for maybe 10 years. My last 10 years I was there, 8 of the last 10 years I was there. But Charles used to say that we want our newspapers to just give our communities a great big hug. And that means that we're going to tell all the good stories, and we're going to love up on the community when we need to, but we're going to be like that brother or sister that tells you when you're wrong and tries to hold you to account. And that was sort of the strategy, and that was the idea behind what we did. Joe can tell you what the strategy is now. Maybe it's exactly the same. But, we did have kind of that core audience that would come to us to read what was news, to come to the editorial page, which, of course, I was very involved with for many years. And we could say, we think these are the biggest issues. I wish I could write about the monolith,
Oh, God.
So, what? Yeah, I could, yeah. I'm still a working journalist, so maybe not. But I mean, we could, Linda knows. I mean, we could write about the Economic Development Corporation and what they were up to, and we were probably 90% positive about what they were doing, but the issues that they were involved with, we could write about. And there was sort of a common understanding of local news among a good part of the community, because the HT was the primary source. There were other sources, but the HT was the primary source. That's been splintered. And so the solution, which I hope we'll get into some possible solutions, is trying to figure out some way to weave these local media outlets together into a place where people can go to get some common ideas and common thoughts of what's important in the community, and sort of trust, as Dave Weaver said, agenda setting. Yes.
The exhibit upstairs goes back to the 1800s in journalism. And the early days of journalism were very much driven by political parties and businesses that had a particular agenda to push. You know, it wasn't the idea of the neutral, tell all sides of a story journalist back in the day. It was tell the side of the story you want people to know. Many of the voices on the internet now take that same approach. We were lucky, I think, to live in our business during the sweet spot where there was so much money to be made in advertising, and being able to bring advertising to a particular demographic, that we could be given free rein to cover the news and to say bad things even about the advertisers. Although with like cigarette advertising, you couldn't run a story about cancer on the same page with a cigarette ad or they wouldn't pay for it. There's some moments, you know. So we'd put it on another page and run two of them just to spite them. But we were in the sweet spot where for most newspapers across the nation, the newsroom was not dictated to by the ownership or the advertising department about what we could or couldn't cover. I think some newspapers had a bend. I think the Indianapolis Star definitely had a more conservative bend than the Bloomington paper did, even though the Bloomington ownership was not exactly a liberal group of people. They let the newsroom do their own thing. But it was an ideal time, and that time is gone now. And to be able to do the news commercially and to also do it without an agenda is going to get increasingly more difficult. Whether that agenda is getting clicks or showing a particular political bend or focusing only on certain kinds of stories that people, indicate they want. We're out of that sweet spot, and I think probably something nonprofit is the only way that's going to be able to provide that objective attempt to tell the news for people.
Bob, do you have anything to add?
Oh.
Here you go.
I have a very difficult time identifying with today's realities because I'm a product of not yesterday, several generations back. I started on a typewriter, for example, and worked through all kinds of advances, and each time it seemed to speed up the operation, which would indicate that we could probably go later, and each time the deadlines moved up, and this would probably be news to Bob that I knew what a deadline was because I tended to violate them occasionally, to the point that when I retired, and I wrote my last sports story 28 years ago, so it's a whole different generation we're talking about. But when I retired, I gave T-shirts to the composing room people and the press room people that had to gnash their teeth waiting on me several times, and several is quite modest, but the T-shirt had a clock with 13 hours on it.
And didn't it say something like, "I survived Bob Hammel"?
I survived the late Bob Hammel.
Yes, the late Bob Hammel.
So that kind of leads us to corporate ownership. So if many of those things you're talking about have gone, what has corporate ownership brought to the paper, and are they determining the character that you're talking about, the mom
the mom and pop role, for example, that you thought you played. So is it the editor then who gets to make these decisions, the corporate owner, the reporters?
That's a question for Jill, not for me. But I will say that we got a taste of corporate ownership. I mean, the Schurz company changed while we were there. And I can remember, just again, anecdotally, somebody comes in with a claim on some money they spent. They give me their receipt. I fill it out. I take it up front. I get a check. I go back. I hand it to them. And then all of a sudden, corporate gets involved, and somebody would bring me their receipt. I would take it up front. Up front would send it to South Bend. South Bend would send it back to me by computer. I would sign off on a computer. It'd go back to South Bend. They put it in the mail, and it'd be 2 weeks before they got their check. So, there were, corporate, all sorts of corporatization was happening already. But, that was an attempt to find efficiencies. The Schurz family, for all the great things I think the Schurz family did, if we were having this panel in Spencer or Martinsville, I don't think they would have been very happy with Schurz family ownership, because those papers were owned by other families that lived in Spencer and lived in Martinsville. And so they saw the Schurz company come in as corporate, as the Schurz company tried to find efficiencies to help maintain the business model for longer. Schurz finally got to the point where they said, we're not the best owners anymore because we can't make the money to reinvest to make the money. So they found a buyer. And, private equity ownership, and Gannett is a publicly traded company, but it's actually, if Gannett, Gatehouse bought us, and then Gatehouse bought Gannett. They merged with Gannett, but Gatehouse was a 51% owner, and Gatehouse is owned by a private equity corporation. Private equity companies have one mission, and their mission is to make profit. So that has got to have an effect on local newsrooms, I would think. But I don't work in a Gannett newsroom, so I really can't talk about that anymore.
Well, and in Gannett's defense, Schurz sold the paper because they couldn't make enough money on it to make it worth their while anymore. That's the bottom line, that's corporate ownership, that's any kind of for-profit ownership. In difficult times is going to have these problems. And that's why I think the only real solution is some nonprofit style of news gathering, because as long as it's driven by profit, you're not going to be focused on trying to present what's best for the reader. You're representing what's going to get the most traction on the internet. And those are often two different things. But if you have a nonprofit, then your focus is serving the public and not serving whoever is expecting a check at the end of the month in the ownership area.
Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm not sure I'm qualified.
Certainly you have thoughts on that.
Well, where the newspapers are concerned today is more of a wish world for me. That I just I have a very difficult time criticizing, because I loved the years I had in the newspapers, and it was such a wonderful life for me, and I could never feel bitter toward the profession itself, and I am pained to see the results of what Bob and Janice have described as forced on the modern newspaper, but and it just makes me feel all the more blessed that my time came when it did, because that was very fortunate.
Yes, I have something else. After Bob retired, there were times, Bob will admit to this, I'm sure, when he would send me a note about some of the things we were doing, because we had, in my opinion, we just didn't have the staff to do the same quality that we were doing before Bob had retired. It was because, like I said, it didn't start the day that Schurz sold the newspaper. It started, some of the issues started before that, but I agree with Bob. It pains me to see what's missing from what used to be a daily newspaper report.
I will say, I take daily pride in the fact that that person right back there, Laura Lane, is that byline is still there. That's my link, and I'm really happy with that. We used to bar her from the sports department because we told her she didn't know anything about sports, and just to kind of stay out here. But she always had my admiration, and she still does.
Okay, let me shift. You have one.
I just want to say that I worked with Laura for many years, of course, but I worked at Jill Bond's elbow for about a year before I retired. And she's very much dedicated to journalism and to serving this community and to making sure that the Herald Times, to the best it can, does that job. She just doesn't have the tools that Bob used to have. Instead of having up to
29 and by left.
29 people, 41 back in the day. You've got 5?
7 if you count me.
7. 5 to 7 people to try to do what 40 or 50 people used to do. It's you have to be much more selective, and I'm sure there's some corporate pressure to make that selectiveness involved in what's going to get clicks, but they're also sneaking in other stuff that we think is important, whether Gannett thinks it's important or not. But there's only so far you can go with 4 or 5 people. They can't be at every meeting. They can't, this monolith thing feels like it snuck up on the community. It's been rattling around in the background since 2018. And if we'd had more reporters at more meetings, it might have been cut off at the pass before they were, already under contract to spend $1 million to put a light pole up at the north end of Bloomington. Having enough people to be at meetings that are boring as hell is sometimes the only way you find out what's really going on in government in time to do something about it.
Were you talking about staff meetings? I do want to say that echo those thoughts on Jill, because we had a meeting in there about 2 weeks ago discussing some of these things, and I made the point there that Jill gives us all hope because she's fighting a lonely battle, and we appreciate that very much.
Okay, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. You all will get a chance to ask some of your questions as well. So or maybe answer some of the questions that they've had. But I want to ask you a little bit about what's happened to politics as a result of the decline in local news. A lot of us have noticed, for example, that certain issues at the university don't get covered the way they did, and have prompted some local citizens to enter the field of reporting when that wasn't their primary job. So I just want to give you a partial quote here from an article that was written in 538 by Joshua Durr, who says, "A growing body of research has found the government is worse off when local news suffers. In fact, inadequate local news has been linked to more corruption, less competitive elections, weaker municipal finances, and a prevalence of basically bad guys who are out there trying to change things, and people who don't bring benefits back to their districts. Do you believe this has occurred in Bloomington? And is the decline in news coverage to blame for this?"
Yeah. I can't say how much it's happened in Bloomington. I mean, I could lay out several. Well, I can remember 2 or 3 significant corruption kind of stories that we were on and that we reported about. I don't know if those things are going on now. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I do know that, there have been several academic studies, Chris would know this too, about the effects of when a newspaper goes away. First one I was familiar with was out of University of Illinois, and I wrote a column about it, and it was about, bond rates and how it was much more difficult for municipalities where there weren't local newspapers to get favorable bond rates because there was nobody watching over what the government was doing. And that was probably a study from 2017, 2018. There have been studies at NYU, at Medill, at the University of North Carolina, at Syracuse about this, what's happening in the news ecosystem now. And a lot of it does talk about a lack of engagement in politics and a lack of civic involvement. Whether that's truly, an issue, a problem in Bloomington or in the state of Indiana, I'm not sure. I mean, there was lots and lots and lots of coverage in Indiana about the last Secretary of State race in Indiana. And I would suggest, with Matt Pierce in the room, that the absolute wrong person was elected, a guy who had all sorts of baggage and all sorts of corruption in his past. So newspapers explained that, told everybody about that, but it didn't matter. So I'm not sure what role we play other than just trying to find out where the corruption is, trying to find out where the issues are, and writing about them and continuing to bring them forward.
And I think part of the issue of why that guy got elected and why these things happen is newspapers don't have the penetration and the trust that they used to. Just because we write about it doesn't mean the average voter either A, reads it, or B, believes it. Because they're getting other information from other sources that say, this is a great guy, he's our guy, Republicans are dominant in Indiana. And if you've got newspaper readers who are also voters who trust their party more than they trust what they read in the paper, you're not going to have that impact. So, the number of people that read the paper and the number of people that put their trust in the paper has changed.
Well, the role of national television, I think, is overwhelming in sowing hate. The division between the two parties is just intolerable, and it began with 24-hour cable news. We used to get our news in the morning and in the afternoon and evening, but now it's 24 hours, and it's bitterly contested. The absolute, and I'll use that word again, hate that prevails in America today is just shocking to me that we aren't all in this together. It's an amazing thing, and I think it has so much to do with the roots of journalism, of news, where we get that. There's a gentleman back here in the audience, Fred Dunn. Fred is as conservative as I am liberal, and we're close friends. And I don't remember ever having had an argument, but that doesn't exist very many places anymore.
But you wouldn't blame this on the local press?
Well,
or the lack of
I think that's the start of it. I think that the local press and local TV, because TV has become such a, in my day it wasn't even there yet. So, we're no longer the United States. We're a very divided states, and that's just intolerable.
I think, Chris, I would suggest that it's a lot worse because there isn't as robust a local presence as there was. So that people like, when there were Republicans in city government in Bloomington, and there used to be quite a few, they would get along with Democrats. They would be able to have their say, but there was I don't know. It's just it was a different time. I also want to say, as an editorial writer and a guy who for years and years did endorsements, people didn't necessarily care what we thought. Remember my just anecdote. One of the first years I was doing endorsements, 11 people run for school board, including Buddy Bill. And I remember doing lots of research on them, interviewing them, going to forums, and then doing an editorial saying, here are what I would consider to be the top 5. Here are 4 more you should vote for. Here are 2 you should absolutely never vote for under any circumstances. They won. So, it's not like people are looking to us all the time to guide them in what they should do.
There was one point when the Plan Commission had an open seat because they were supposed to have one Republican on it, and they couldn't find one that would take it. Well, I got a call that one night, and that was the year when Richard Lugar was defeated for re-election. And that year I crossed over to vote for Richard Lugar because I thought he was such a tremendous person, and the guy running against him and beating him was terrible. and so for 4 years I was enlisted in the rolls as a Republican, and so to fill that spot on the Plan Commission, the guy called me and said, "Would you be interested?" Well, Bob wrote a story not long after that listing a number of Democrats that had been names that had been come up as or not particularly Democrats, but names that had come up, and turned the job down. And I called him and said, "Why didn't you list me? They offered it to me too." He said, "If you'd have come on there as a Republican, I'd have outed you."
I'm not going to name names because I don't remember, and it's been too long. But we also had an instance in Bloomington where there was a Democrat in county government who we wrote any number of stories about how basically incompetent they were and problems that had been going on. And because they were a Democrat and they were in Bloomington, they still got reelected to office. So it's not just the Republicans that don't listen to us. The Democrats are good at not listening to us too.
So Bloomington, again, a little bit of a shift here, is a town that is dominated by Indiana University. How has your relationship with Indiana University and over the years and impacted the kinds of coverage you've had of this community? And how do you think the readers saw this? Did they think that you were overly favoring coverage of IU, or how do you think about that? I think Bob Hammel should start and answer this question.
I'll let Bob go last. He's got the most to say about this. So I would say that probably, the truth is probably we looked like we were very supportive of IU a lot of the time in our coverage, whether it was in news or in sports. You mentioned Michael McRobbie gave me a medal at the end of things, but I also had several conversations with Michael and other presidents. I had at least one very uncomfortable conversation with any of the 5 presidents that were in office when I was the editor of the paper, because they didn't like something that we had done. And I will also tell you, and that, I'm naming names up here, but there was a time when Bill Armstrong, whose name is on Bill Armstrong Stadium, was the president of the IU Foundation, and there were a lot of things going on at the foundation, and we were looking deeply into what was going on at the foundation. And it turned out that Mr. Armstrong, which is what everybody called him, was indicted on some, I don't know what the exact charges were.
It was money.
But it had to do with money. But during this time, Scott Schurz, my boss, was on the IU Foundation board and was probably Bill Armstrong's best friend in town. At least that's one of the things Scott told me when he called me in and said, "I hear from Bill you're looking into the foundation and to him." And I said, "Yes, that's true." He said, "Bill's one of my best friends." And I said, "Well, I wasn't sure how close you were, but thanks for telling me. And he said, I said, do you think we shouldn't do this story? And he said, no, but I just think you better get it right. That was the only thing he said. And we kept covering it, and I think we got it right.
So that was the biggest.
That was the biggest IU thing. I mean, biggest split between me and Scott.
No,
Oh, no, between me and with the university.
Oh,
Oh, probably. I mean, there were lots of things. When Michael Rushke was the IU reporter, he wrote a story that Michael McRobbie didn't like, and I had to go talk to, vice president and somebody else, and they were like, Michael really wants you to take Michael Rushke off the beat. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. So, Michael's going to have to just deal with Michael Rushke.
Still paying for that, by the way.
You are?
Yeah, IU still doesn't
Oh,
want
okay. So, but I also had lunch with Bob. I'll turn it over to Bob because I also had lunch with Bob once with Bob and Bob Knight when Bob Knight told me that he wanted me to take Len Hauser off the beat.
There you go.
I had some lunches with Bob Knight too. But obviously, Indiana University was my primary assignment, so that was inevitable. There were going to be times when people out there didn't. We had to cover it when they lost too, and they didn't always like that. But it was. I don't want to put a negative side on it because I had a really tremendous relationship. But I think the thing that I always tried to keep in mind was we had 5 to 7 people in sports, and basically I was the only one that was covering IU. My insistence from the beginning was to cover these high schools as strongly as we could, because I think that's Indiana. Indiana is high school athletics, and I'm really sorry that they've had to cut back so much. We built through the whole area, out through Linton and Bloomfield, and of course Edgewood, but Brown County, and the area coverage was excellent, I thought, and that was a big part of our strength that we cared about, and of course the North and South were enormous stories for it, and they're still covered, but not to the degree that we were able to with the staffs we had, and but primarily John Harrell was assigned to do was a tremendous desk man and organized everything for us. But our other guys were basically high school coverage from school time on, and except one person would be assigned to soccer, because that became such a big sport at the same time as football, and there was no way I could do both. But I could take swimming with the Spitz years, for example, and track, the baseball. Those were all sports that I could handle and not require somebody from taking off their high school beats to do IU most of the time. But the relationship, there obviously were times of tension, but overall, no, I think I had a strong respect out there.
Any major conflicts you can?
Oh, of course. They seemed major at the time for 24 hours or so, but they all blew over.
I think you got out of that easy. Okay, well, maybe it's time to open it up for the audience to ask their questions, because I'm sure there are some burning issues that you have had or thought about over the years. Yes.
This is not the most important issue now with regard to newspapers dying, but I'm just wondering if any of you would like to talk about 9/11 and what the hell you did that day. When you found out that those planes had hit the towers, it was mid-morning, and you say you got newspapers on the street at 2 o'clock. How did you do that?
Thank you, Randy West, who worked for a long time at the, speak of political parties, the Oregon Democrat. My memory is that we all came together, just like Janice said. When things happen, people come together and say, "What can I do? What can I do?" And we would sit around in a room and say, "Well, why don't you try to call this person? You can call this person." Somebody would get a call or an email from. I remember Karen Mikesell was working in our newsroom, and her daughter was in New York and could see the towers from her window. So if somebody get a hold of her, Laura.
I interviewed her, she was on her roof.
Mhm.
I had her on the phone.
Right.
We got something in, yeah.
My wife worked with Jim Boer's wife at IU. Jim Boer was leading a tour of the Pentagon with people from SPIA and Crane on that day. And so this is one of, I hate to say this, no, I don't, I'm going to say it. I had the only byline on the front page that day because I talked to Jim Boer about an hour after he got out of the Pentagon because his wife gave my wife his cell phone number. So, we had Rudy Pizzotti's daughter was in New York, and we found out about that and talked to her. We talked to IU experts about, what is going on out there. We just tried to, we divide the work, and then people go out, do the interview. We did a person on the street. What do where were you when this happened? What are your feelings right now? I think we had something about gas prices starting to go up already. So it was an 8-page section with all local stories and, of course, AP wire photos. I think Bob Hammel wrote something for it. It was something that was comparable to the Hindenburg. I think you quoted the announcers after the Hindenburg disaster. Maybe a little. Oh, was that one? Okay. Right.
So many disasters.
Yeah, but that wasn't an extra. But yeah, I think what you do in a case like that is you get everybody together and you say, what are the angles we should go for? You make a big list on a whiteboard, and then people go for it, and then you dump it all on Janice and pray it's going to look great.
She had to get up much earlier than usual that day.
Yeah.
I actually woke her up so she could watch the.
I actually did not put out the extra. I'm not sure who did that day, but I had to come in and take all the stuff from the extra and then re-edit and add and alter things and do the edition that went to readers the next morning.
Yeah, I think that I was on vacation. Someone called me to come in.
So
but I think they didn't have regular staff because they had to turn around and do it in the evening. So
Yeah, so
the layout people who worked in the features and stuff like
I was into the office by sometime early in the afternoon and focused on the extra was great, but it had limited circulation. I think they passed it around downtown or whatever. It didn't even get sold. But a lot of those stories got repurposed and updated for the next morning's paper. So our crew was focused on that. And, nobody knew what was going to happen. Was there going to be another plane in another hour? I mean, it was a crazy time.
Is that special section in a bound volume that might be for sale?
The extra was not in the bound volume. I looked. So it either was never in there to begin with, or somebody cut it out in the intervening years.
Speaking of that, one other question I didn't ask was, do you think that the local newspaper was the internet of its time? As I was looking back at those old volumes, there was so much information you got that wasn't a news story that told you how to live your life day by day. From the grocery ads on Wednesdays, to the movie times, to the court news, to who had a baby, to who was entered the hospital or was dismissed. I even forgot 80% of what used to be in that newspaper. Is that a fair comparison, given the technological differences?
I think it is. I mean, it's a huge technological difference, but we used to refer to it as the Daily Miracle, and then it started to be like the every 4 hour miracle, and now it's like the minute to minute miracle. So, but yeah, I mean, I was looking through some old papers from 2014, just 9 years ago, recently, and I was shocked by the volume of information that was in there, and all the different places that we would lump information together. Like, of course, we had the old police beat, but then also there were all these recreation calendar, the arts calendar, the all the community service clubs, just so many different things that were in there, which there wasn't any other common place for people to find them. And of course, technology has changed all that. There are places people look for that now that they used to look to the paper for.
I think CNN and Gulf War was the first point where 24-hour news really started changing how we looked at what we put in the local newspaper. When I was a kid, you got your news at 6 o'clock at night and maybe at 11 o'clock at night on TV, and that was your TV news. But when CNN started going 24 hours, and the Gulf War was going on, and something would be happening at 10 or 11 at night that we might be striving to try to put into the paper, people had already seen it on TV. And by the time our paper got to their doorstep and they were reading it 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock the next morning, the story was totally different by then. So that really shifted our focus to be more local in terms of breaking news and more, what does this mean? What's the story behind it with national and international news? Because the breaking of what happened, if people wanted to know, they probably already got it off of CNN. And then it wasn't too many years after that before they were getting it off the internet. And, they didn't even have to be home watching TV. Once smartphones happened, they've got it in their pocket. They can see it wherever they are, whenever they are. And the smartphone was another change after the internet that really altered. It wasn't, we used to see that our hottest time for online readership on our website was about 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning, when everybody got to work, and instead of doing work, they were reading news on our website, especially with the IU sources. But, they would catch up then. But now it's on their phone. They might be reading it while they're brushing their teeth, getting ready to go to work. Or they might have read it the night before at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night. It's 24 hours, and it's in your hand all the time.
For years, the newspapers were known as the first draft of history, and that's a role I think still works. In retirement, I got to know George Juergens, a distinguished professor of history at IU. We'd never met until we both were retired. We started going to lunch together, and we both enjoyed the contrast in the way we would look at things. I would look at an event today in the way that I would write about it tomorrow. I wanted it to come out tomorrow with the significance of what happened yesterday. And George would argue that you won't really know for 50 years. Look back at 50 years and see what the impact of that event was. So, and I really didn't have 50 years to write on my story. So, but he was a tremendous person, and I learned a lot of. I formed a lot of respect for that very view that you really don't know what the impact of some events until many, many years after, and what they've done. But our job as a newspaper is to put them into perspective immediately, and to try to show how they fit into history, how they even in sports events, things of that nature. It's how important was this really? How big a win was this really? I think we still look at the newspaper as the first draft, and the volumes that Jill is selling bring bring that into perspective, because if I always said, where we stored that was downstairs in what we called the morgue. Michael Carita wrote about that beautifully. But I would go down there with one particular thing in mind, and find the volume that covered that, and leafing through it, I've run across all kinds of things that would divert me. And I always compared it with the person who said, anyone who thinks cleaning out an attic can be done quickly can't read, because you can get diverted into wonderful following certain stories that the newspaper covered from beginning to end, and you just have to follow that to see how it came out.
Other questions, Jill?
So speaking from experience here, people are weird, right? And the newsroom is where you're going to see maybe the strangest behavior or oddest thing that anybody ever said to you on the phone or in person. And so I'd love to hear your stories about strangeness or oddities that happened during the time that you were at the paper.
I thought you meant strange people in the newsroom itself.
Now that might be it, you know? Oh, no, don't tell their secrets. That one's still around.
Oh, I'm sure we've all had them. Nothing jumps out to me. The public was awfully kind. I had some I had some calls that were not. I wasn't exactly confined in my sports writing. I would vary some, and I came out very strongly against the in the sports section on the invasion of Iraq, and gave a kind of an excuse for a takeoff. IU and Purdue had played the night before in basketball, and I talked about how kids of that age were the ones that were going to be put in jeopardy because we were worried about oil. but the Ted Kitchells and the people just like that, the kids of that age were the ones that were going to be in jeopardy. Well, it turned out to be not much of a jeopardy in that particular situation, but it's been a long-term headache for America ever since. But it was the day that column ran, about 4 o'clock, I got a call, and a man was crying, and he said, "How could you write that?" Because he had a son who was in Desert Storm, and I thought I was writing on behalf of his son, but he took it as a antipathy toward the U.S. military, and I could understand, but it was difficult holding that phone with that man on the other end crying. that was quite an experience.
I might be a while. Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I mean, there were several very weird situations. I remember one guy that called and he was very, very distressed because he was downtown. It was like 5 degrees outside, and he said he was running around in his fluorescent running shorts, and they were very short, and people were looking at him funny, and they were giving him a rough time, and he might just have to shoot the next person then. Oh, no. And so I had to talk him down, and then called the police and said, "Hey, I don't know about this guy," because he was threatening to shoot somebody. And then, within about 10 minutes, he must have gotten a bus down to the HT because he came in, said, "This is what I'm wearing. How do I look? I don't look weird, do I?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, you don't look weird at all." So, I mean, that, I remember that one.
Bob, tell about the time that somebody came into your office with a gun. I don't know whether you knew it at the time, but
yeah, I didn't know it at the time. But no, okay, I will. This is a woman that came in one day, and I went out to the library where we have the little library to sit and talk to her. And I had had enough experience with mental health issues to realize she was in some kind of crisis, but I don't think I reacted very well to it. I mean, I reacted to her well. I was just trying to be very helpful. She was talking about people following her everywhere and that she just didn't like being followed and she wasn't hurting anybody. And Chris Howell, one of our photographers, walked in and she said, like him, he was at the doctor's office when I was there. And I said, I don't think so. He's a photographer here. He's just coming to do his job. And so anyway, we had a chat, very nice chat. And I thought I got her into a good space. I probably should have called, Phil Stafford or somebody to get me more help. But she left. And the next morning she came back to the office about 8 o'clock, wanted to see me. And I wasn't there. I was actually at a breakfast meeting. I wasn't there. She got mad and said, okay, I'm leaving. I understand, but I'm going to leave. And about 3 hours later, she was in a traffic jam up near Lafayette, and she got out of her car and went back and shot the person who was behind her in traffic because she was following her. I mean, that was the way her mind was working. And the person didn't die or anything, thank goodness. And I think that the woman who did the shooting got help. So that was kind of an odd thing, and that was a time when we closed down the newsroom. I mean, we had police come in, and police gave us a briefing about what to do, and one of the things I kind of feel, I am so delighted that they did this, but I also felt pretty much like a chicken. They were like, well, if somebody comes in to see Bob, don't let them back to see him. And don't have him come up to see them, have somebody else intervene, because if they're that angry, that could go, awry. And so we'd have, Shirley Bushy or send Laura up. But, that was another one. I had a state trooper call me one day and said, have you had anything weird go on? Because we've had a threat against your life. And I'm not that I know of. And as it turned out, this person, as a trooper told me, had threatened to kill, had sent his ex-girlfriend a letter saying he's going to kill her, but first he's going to kill me and William Hudnut, the mayor of Indianapolis. And they did arrest him finally. They called me and said, well, he just picked your name because he'd heard your name, and that was the only reason he used it. You've never met him. So that was weird. And then one more thing, just a story about probably the most interesting person I ever met. At the paper was a woman named Mabel Gunther, and I talked to her every day, not every day. I talked to her once a week at least for about 11 years. She would call me, and she had this really gravelly voice. She'd always start by saying, now, honey, I've been watching Conan on TV, and I learned this or that or whatever. And I would kind of tune her out. And then one day she said, honey, the truth is a prism that's shattered at the top of the world, and all we ever find are the shards. And I was like, oh my gosh, I better start paying attention to her. And I took notes for like the next 9 or 10 years. I took notes, and I wrote a big feature on her after she died. It was like, Tuesdays with Mabel before Tuesdays with Maury. But I never wrote a book about her, but I went to her funeral and wrote after she had died at age 92. She was 81. I'd gone to her house several times to talk to her about different issues in her life. And, that's an odd thing, right? But when you're a newspaper editor or a newspaper reporter, you find these people that you connect with people for whatever reason. And I will never forget Mabel Gunther and the Shards of Truth.
I should have gone before him because how would I follow that? We, on the copy desk, would get the phone calls, all the phone calls for the newspaper after everybody else went home for the day, because we were working 4 to midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, getting the final edits and last minute stories from the city council or a photograph from the basketball game or whatever, and putting it all together and getting the paper ready to go out the door. So the night bell, as they would call it, would ring into the copy desk area. And you'd get a weird mix of people. People would just want basic information and want you to look something up for them, like you were the information desk at the library. And we did that whenever we could. We tried to put a good face on it, although we were busy trying to get the paper out. And when they wanted to talk forever, like Mabel, we really didn't have time to listen. So we got really good at shutting people down fairly quickly. But, somebody connected with IU called up one night and was adamant about getting more Pakistani news in the paper. And you don't really think about when you're putting out a newspaper in Bloomington, Indiana, because of the university, the variety of people that are reading your work every day. You've got people from Pakistan. You've got people living in Greene County who, if you looked at their family tree, it's all in this region for several generations. That was one of the challenges of trying to put our newspaper out every day, was the diversity of our readership. If you were in Bedford, you knew pretty much who your readership was. But in Bloomington, because of the university, 6 degrees of separation, there was always somebody connected to whatever was going on wherever in the world. It made for a very metropolitan job in a fairly small town because of that angle. But mostly we got calls from people that didn't want their name in the police beat. And, we had to kind of politely tell them, we have certain offenses which, if you're arrested, your name is going to be in police beat. And in those days, we also followed it up with court news saying what happened to them. And now we don't do either one of those things because we can't follow up anymore. But, if you were caught drunk driving, or if you were, public intox or something else, there were misdemeanors that we ignored, and there were things we put in the paper. And if you were charged with a felony or charged with drunk driving, your name was going to be in the paper. My mother will die if she sees it in the paper. Well, did you think about that before you got drunk and went out driving? It's not really our fault that your mother's going to be upset that you got arrested for getting.
So did you stop? Was there a particular reason why you stopped running that kind of news?
We wanted to be fair, and if you're going to say somebody was charged with something, that doesn't necessarily mean they were guilty of it, or that even if they were guilty of it, that they were convicted of it. And so if we weren't going to, put the outcome of the case in, it seemed unfair to just paint them with the arrest, because while we respect law enforcement, there are people that are arrested for reasons other than committing a crime.
Yeah, there was a time when my job was to put the people in the police beat when they got arrested. And then I went to the Justice Building every day and I read the court news, and so I would be writing up when the case was adjudicated, guilty, whatever. And that, can you imagine doing, that was my whole job almost, that and covering other news. And if you think of, I went to Bob, I think you changed the policy, right? Was it Rich Jackson?
I drug my feet until somebody else changed it.
Okay, so I complained for a long
credit for
time
it.
until someone else changed it, but I felt like it was unfair to be putting the names of people, everybody, just random people who stood not guilty without following through with the end, and we couldn't do it anymore.
Right, and I'm very happy that the policy was changed, even though I oversaw it for so long. It was a very popular column. People loved reading it.
If we were doing it now, we would get so many clicks.
Yeah.
Gannett would love it, but Gannett is one of they believe that we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, it's
so
really wise, because we would, those police beat would be a preliminary charge, and the charge may change the next day when they went to the prosecutor's office. Or never get filed.
And one of the problems of the internet is if we put in that somebody was charged with something, even though it got dropped the next day, that's going to rattle around on the internet for the rest of their lives. And it's very hard to purge something, even if you take it out.
Oh, yeah.
Purge something from the internet once it's there.
Yeah.
And if they see the charge, they might not even also see the court news where it was adjudicated. And there are places you can go to find out how court cases come out. But, if you're applying for a job and you've got, a charge of drunken disorderly or something while you were a college student, it could influence whether or not you get hired for something. And, you probably, if it was Little Five, cleaned up the stadium and got, some sort of probation or something.
So that happened in the time, the decision not to run that news anymore happened in the time of the internet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we still get, I still got a call or an email from somebody about a month ago. Yeah, from somebody saying, hey, my friend talked to you 10 years ago and now I'm having this issue and can you help me with this? I couldn't help him and I'm not going to help you.
But we live in a society where it's public record information and it's
Absolutely.
available to anyone who wants to get it. So I would always use that as a comeback sometimes as to explain why I would be putting someone's name in the paper. And also that Scott Schurz, our publisher, was arrested for drunken driving, and we put him in the police beat. That was the standard. Once I told people that, they just hung up the phone, 'cause that was the standard. He went in, everybody went in.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, I have so many questions, so interesting. I don't really know which one to ask. But you were talking about the value of the newspaper and providing an opportunity for people to express themselves through their own voices. And even though people are writing their own obituaries now, I actually wish they were being written for them, because I think the newspaper has also been important in promoting literacy in our community. So that's kind of another institutional consequence of, its diminishment. But I'm curious, I used to love to read all the letters to the editor, and people took on the shape of characters, and you came to look forward to them, even though you might violently disagree with what you're writing about. But they occupied a place in the community that was available to them, which was important, and sometimes they paid for it. When I first moved here, it was the Freedomgram for Sane Government that Dr. Ramsey used to write, and I guess he had to pay for his voice, but. He did. Anyway, I'm just curious, it relates a little bit in terms of how you make these choices of what to print, and just if you could reflect on that issue and the challenge for you.
Yeah, I'll take that first. I think Jill or Gannett or somebody made the decision to do away with the editorial page, and while I hate it because I respect it because I know how much time it took. Those letters to the editor would come in, and it would take a lot of time to verify them. I had somebody else on the staff who was calling to make sure that this person who said they were writing was writing. So you have to verify them. You'd have to do some fact checking. Sometimes we didn't do enough fact checking, but it gave people a voice in the community. And you're absolutely right. Certain people would write about certain things. They'd take their once a month shot and write about it. Before an election, they'd write about their favorite candidates. But it was very time consuming to do it. Plus, after Kurt Vanderdusen, God rest his soul, died, I got the job of writing 90% of the editorials. Kurt wrote about 80% when he was alive, and I wrote 20%, then I wrote 90%. So, writing opinions, having opinion pages that were robust, I always thought was a really high value mark of the local newspaper. And while I'm sorry it's gone, I very much understand when you've got limited resources, you got to figure out where you can make a change.
Charlotte Zitlow in the back there has her hand up. You have a question?
I think that the newspaper has really helped make better policy in the past. It made people who are in office also have to pay attention to things, and I just thought it was very helpful. I think we would not have a courthouse if Kurt Vanderdusen had kicked me every day.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you couldn't hear, Charlotte was just saying that she feels the newspaper had an important role in shaping the community and doing things like saving the courthouse. And,
Yeah, right.
So did Charlotte, very much so. All we did was give you a bandwagon to stand on. You did the yelling.
Any others?
think there's a difference in the way that people process print journalism versus TV journalism. In a sense, say for example, if I read a speech in the newspaper, I can then process it. Now it seems like you see the speech on TV and then you see 10 hours of people telling you what was said, whether that was what was said or not. Can you talk about that a bit?
Bob's a real political guy.
I really didn't. I'm 110 years old, and one of my hearing aids is going out. I have a real problem with what was the crux of that.
So go ahead and repeat that if you.
So my question is there a difference in the way people used to read the newspaper and process the news versus what we see now with, for example, 24-hour CNN, where they have to spend the next 20 hours telling you what was said and telling you what they think was said, whether that was what was said or not? Do people have more trouble figuring out for themselves what is in the news versus?
I think that has contributed to the isolation between the two groups, and I don't think it was a question. And there's, there's never been in my lifetime as much of a disparity in news presentation as there is in cable news right now. And it's if you only get one, you've got a really one-sided view, and it's and they do the kinds of things you're talking about. They'll hammer their own points back and forth, and it's just a very difficult time to live right now because we're driven to dislike each other rather than unite each other, and it's I think part of that is the declined role of the newspaper. The television is the dominant news source without any question, and we kind of tag along. but in my own role in sports, it became a real challenge because in a weekday game, for example, games played on a Tuesday night. By the time I write, or they read me the next morning, they've seen the game, they've seen replays during the game, they've seen interviews after the game, they've seen highlights of the game, specialized interviews with the players, and then I'm supposed to come along and tell them something that they don't know. Well, it was a challenge, and it's just such a different world, and you're touching on it. Bob has his own views, I'm sure, on the news end of it.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, a couple things. One is everybody learns differently, right? They consume news differently. So some people learn better if they get to read something and then soak it in. Some people learn better if somebody is standing in front of a room lecturing them and telling them what the information is. But, I have my little retirement job with WFIU, WTIU, and the first time I did a couple stories for them, I was like, I can't possibly tell this story in the short amount of time you're giving me. I was going to do a story on a retrospective. Somebody asked a question. I was going to do a story on the retrospective of PCBs in the community, and I turned this story in. I turned this story into Sarah Whitmire at WFIU, and she's like, Bob, it's going to be like 11 minutes, and we only have 4 minutes. And I'm like, she gave me 7, so I had to cut it down to 7 minutes.
Details, Bob.
I know. Well, Bob.
Well, the other part of this is the social media entry into it, so it gets recast. The other day I was listening to a story about the memory of Sarah Palin that she could see Russia from her back door. Well, Sarah Palin never said that, it turns out. It was Tina Fey who said it on the Saturday Night Live coverage. So it's also how we remember events if you don't read the whole speech yourself.
Yeah, I would like to hear just briefly what each of you is thinking about the future of news in Bloomington specifically. I know Janice mentioned it a little bit, but I'm interested to know what folks think.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be thinking a lot about that. I've been fortunate enough to be invited to be on the Community Foundation Board. Betsy Trotsky's here, and she's been working on that, and I think I'm going to be working with her on that. I don't have a solution. I think I do agree that the solution is going to be some kind of a nonprofit solution. I look at Bloomington, and I look at the wide range of people covering the community now. The HT continually has really strong stories. They can't get around and cover everything, but they still have strong stories every day about a variety of things. WFIU and TIU, has a newsletter every afternoon and is trying to get to more meetings and has a bigger staff, actually, than the HT does, but it's also a very inexperienced staff. Dave Askins goes to all these board meetings. You've got the Limestone Post doing feature work. I would like to think that there might be a solution that the Community Foundation can help support through this local news fund that Jill is working on, and perhaps other strategies that will look at where are these niches and where are there shortcomings in coverage, and where can a nonprofit organization step in and help support coverage of local education, for instance, or even high school sports, for instance, or the nonprofit sector, which I think is another area that I would say, in terms of being proud, I'm proud that when the last probably 15 years that I was at the paper, I had great reporters who wanted to do coverage of nonprofit issues in the community. So we were able to have a nonprofit beat and had a lot of people who were just covering all those issues around the community. So there are niches that I think we have to figure out where are the holes, and how can a nonprofit model help fill those holes. I don't have the answer. I know that that's one of the things I've been thinking of. Charlotte has a question.
My question is, how can the newspaper serve business better too? Because Goods for Cooks is 50 years old this week, or next month. And we got a lot of help by having articles in the paper saying this new store is coming and it's going to be downtown. Surprise. And that it really helped us get off the ground. And I think that, and the other day there was a detailed article in the HTT about the restaurants moving around. That's really helpful, and I think the business community also depends on its presence and its people knowing about it. So that's something that I'm concerned about.
Yeah, the issue of how do we cover the business community? Yeah. That's business, economic development, all those issues, the industrial base of Bloomington, all those things are definitely important.
Or the issues we don't know anything about. Like I learned yesterday in Blooming Foods that Macy's is going to be torn down for yet another group of houses. Why don't I know that?
Well, I don't know. I'm learning it here for the first time. Yeah, right.
Expect to see that in HT next week.
Yeah.
Riding in town and
Everyone in Blooming Foods who was shopping was appalled that they couldn't drive in or drive out of the place anymore. That the city has imposed traffic lanes and sidewalks and green zones so that you can't even get to the business anymore. So I haven't read a story about that. I've experienced it. I talked to my friends about it, but this isn't going to change things over time. This is why I am so sad that we don't have this.
Yeah, covering the business community has always been a staple, but also a difficult thing because, how do you cover each individual business fairly? Because once you cover You know, you cover one jewelry store for their 25th anniversary, and the other 5 jewelry stores want a story about them too. And that's just a sidelight. But the business community is a huge part of the community, and another area that needs and deserves coverage because people want to know what's going on. I always like to tell a story about how we got a restaurant column in the paper, because every time we'd have a meeting, in the morning, somebody would talk about a new restaurant going into town, and the meeting would immediately devolve into talking about what new restaurant and what people liked about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if anybody else knows that AMC 11 is closed from.
Yeah. It's in the paper.
I have seen the story about AMC
closed forever.
Yeah. I think one of the, we talked about having like 50 people in the newsroom, and they weren't all reporters. I mean, some of those were my copy desk people that edited and designed. We had a couple clerks. We had people doing functions that now, like dealing with the internet, that some people outside of our local newsroom do some of those functions now, like assembling the pages of the newspaper and doing some of the promotion work for our website. But with 50-some people coming in and out of the newsroom and another, 100 people working in the building, we'd hear about stuff because we were interacting with more people who interacted with people outside of the newsroom that heard about stuff or knew somebody that worked at so-and-so. And when you shrink it down to, 5 people coming in and out of a newsroom building at any given time, we don't get that I know something's going on, you should be writing about it in the paper thing as much. Now, the internet is a whole new thing to mine that we didn't have back in the day. But how much time can you spend flicking through Facebook or through Twitter or whatever trying to keep up with what everybody's talking about that may or may not be true?
How much time, Jill? How much time do you spend doing that? A lot. That's where we get a lot of our tips about news anymore. It's like, what's happening in Ellisville or Owen County Chatter or places like that.
If I was working on the news desk at night and there was a big fire or a wreck or a tornado or something happened nationally, somebody would die. Everybody that worked for the paper would be calling me saying, we just want to make sure that you know that this happened so you can get it in the paper tomorrow. We could barely get the paper out because we were answering the phone so much trying to field all these tips we were getting from people that knew we needed to know.
One last question.
Well, I was going to say that the stories that have been told indicate that it's not just about news or truth, which is pretty fundamental in the community, but we've described what's really a community institution on a par with schools, on a par with churches, and so there's a lot more potentially being lost with the diminishment of the institution. To promote literacy, you described a newsroom that was well connected in the community because these were jobs that people stayed in. The reporters were part of the community, and there was a network of information that was bolstered by the relationship with other people in the community. Citizens could get to know reporters and call a reporter to ask them to pitch a story. And I would have no idea anymore other than Laura, I guess, a story about the garage sale or something. So it played a much major role, and I hope the foundation, in considering what's been lost, will pay attention to the issue of news and truth, of course, but some of these other important functions that the paper served in the community are perhaps being lost too.
Yeah, I want to add before, I know Hillary has a question back there, but I want to just add, and Bob Hammel and Janice both know this, there were so many great people working in the newspaper office that weren't in the newsroom. And when you think about Jill's 7 people, I think aren't there like 4 circulation people still working in town somewhere? Or
yeah, but they don't work in the same
right,
facility as us, so we never even interact.
But there were 150 or 200 people that were employed by the paper and they did come to tell us what was going on or criticize us for the way we reported a story that wasn't quite right. But they were really big cheerleaders for what we were doing too, and a really major part of it. So I just want to congratulate all of them too. Well, Kathy said.
And the very last question,
I just have a quick question about what you all thought was the role of the IDS, because that's something that we hadn't discussed yet, is that we talked about the relationship between the Herald Times and Indiana University, but also there is another print paper in the county, and it's the IDS. So I know that the role of the IDS is largely this teaching space for students to learn and how to put together a paper, and among other things with the New School of Journalism, but can they help fill this gap of reporting community news and local journalism? Because I'm thinking of the IDS breaking the story about, in 2019, of the Commissioner Amanda Barge, and that led to her resigning. And so I'm like, they broke that news. And so I'm like, what is the space that the students can help fill? And like, does it need to be all on community members? I think it should be, but like, what do you maybe think the role of the IDS could be in this as well?
Bob, I want you to handle this, but I'm going to repeat the question. The role of the IDS for, in covering news in the community, and you've had a lot of interaction with people from the IDS over the years.
There you go.
Well, our primary benefit from the IDS was people. We had some wonderful people in sports and certainly in news that got their start in journalism in the IDS, and I hope that can survive and thrive, because it's such a foundation. One of the interesting aspects of that particular situation, when Title IX came into effect in 1970, suddenly there were women's sports to cover. And there were no women sports writers throughout America, and we hired two young women right out of IU. In fact, they were still going to IU at the time. Tracy Dodds, Kristen Hochschorn, and they when they graduated after working with us, Tracy for a couple of years, Kristen for all 4 of her years. We did not put them. Most papers were hiring women because men didn't want to cover women's sports, to be frankly, and we didn't do it that way. We put them on. Kristen, for example, was our soccer reporter. She covered the men's soccer team in the national championships, and Tracy covered the Martinsville High School football team, and there was nobody tougher to cover than Martinsville football coach Bill Sarderwitz. So they cut their teeth with really strong reporting challenges. Well, both of them wound up with terrific jobs. Tracy went straight to the Milwaukee Journal and went on their staff, and then later was with the Los Angeles Times, and covered headed up the Times swimming coverage for the '84 Olympics. She went all around the world, backgrounding that, and then headed the coverage during the games. Then she became the sports editor of the Austin American Herald in Texas, and which was actually the biggest position for a woman in sports in America. And she was on the AP Sports Editors Board of Directors, a very prominent woman. Kristen went to the San Jose Mercury News, which was the 10th largest paper in the country at the time. And the sports editor there had been at Milwaukee when Tracy went up, and he called me after he interviewed Kristen, and he said, "Bob, you're going to have to do a lot more work preparing your women, your young people for interviews." I kind of laughed and said, "Well, what Kristen to do this time?" And he said, "Well, it came time to offer her the job," and I said, "Well, no, this is like in the 1980s." And he said, "How does 450 sound?" And he said she got a kind of a blank look on her face, and she said, "I'm making 5 now." And he grabbed her paper and looked at it. And he said, "No, I meant 450 a week, not 450 an hour." But anyway, she became very, very prominent out there. And Kristen was one of 4 women who formed the organization called AWESOME. The acronym was AWESOME, AWSM, American Women in Sports Media. And it's one of the outstanding women's professional organizations going right now. And Tracy was one of their lead people too. So after 10 years, they named they didn't have a Hall of Fame. They named it Pioneer each year, and that became their Hall of Fame. And 2 of the first 6 people selected to that Hall of Fame were Tracy Dodds and Kristen Huckshorn. So we were very proud of that.
Yeah, let me mention that that's something Bob did. He really got women involved. Kristen also worked for the New York Times, and she was like the Vietnam bureau chief for the New York Times for a while. But as far as Hillary, your question about the IDS, I certainly agree with everything Bob said. We've always gotten good people. I think college media is very important in filling gaps today, because they are really large staffs at the bigger universities with big media schools and journalism schools, but they're under a great deal of stress too. I mean, I don't have any idea how long the print edition, the one-day print edition of the IDS is going to survive. I've been told that they're good for at least this year because of the revenue from the Kroger ad, which no longer goes in print, but they got an online Kroger advertising contract, which will help support the print edition. But there are a lot of great young journalists over there. They're really good journalism faculty members over there that are helping build them. I know the HT's had a couple of really terrific interns in the last few years. Kate Sharon was like the college journalist of the year, and I can't remember the others, but college journalism is a huge part of the solution in my mind.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Yes. Thank you all for coming, and thank to the 3 of you for all of the great memories and your great advice on where we go from here. We probably don't have all the answers. That's the problem. And thanks to the History Center for hosting this event. I think it was a great idea. And
so we'd like to invite you, if you haven't had the chance to see the exhibit, you're welcome to head upstairs. And if you are around downtown during Lotus Festival, we are going to be doing some free printing demonstrations with the Washington Press in the afternoon. So there are all kinds of things that you can see. You get your hands on the history of journalism in our community, and there will be more panel discussions to come throughout this year. So we thank you so much for your time today, and hope you have a lovely Saturday afternoon.
Thank you.